y'all, and welcome back to My Creative Life with Kel Sweetie, where we make crafts, where we celebrate the holidays, and most importantly, we read a lot of books and essentially do whatever our creative hearts desire. Today, we are covering a book challenge that I've given myself for this month after Goodreads put out a list of 66 best horror and thriller books that were published in the last 3 years. So I want to talk about some of the books that were on that list that I already read and how I rated them, as well as 4 books that I'll be reading this next month to see how they stack up on their rating list. So let's get into it. Hey y'all, so I will be going over the list that Goodreads made this year. Readers' top 66 horror novels of the past 3 years. I don't know how they kind of came to these numbers, if it was based off of ratings or what, but I do know that I read some of these books on here, as well as there were some new reads, and I thought it'd be cool if I picked 4 of the novels that I felt like were like the best that I hadn't already read, and see how I felt about them, as well as talking a little bit about some of the books that I have read that are already on this list, and even some of the books that are still going to be on my TBR and may not be a part of this challenge. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. So to start off, they start the entire list with Mexican Gothic, which I can't find the article again, unfortunately, so luckily I had taken screenshots. So bear with me as I'm going back and forth from my phone to talking to you guys. But they started off with Mexican Gothic, which plenty of people have told me to read. They said that it's really great. It is a slow build, but that some people have even said that reading this book got them back into reading and everything. It has been on my list. I mean to read it. One day I will, but more books keep on coming out, so it keeps on getting pushed down. And unfortunately, it didn't make the list this time. I felt like I didn't want something slow, and I feel like Mexican Gothic is really atmospheric, so it got pushed aside for the time being. But I will read it one day. However, I did read their second book that's on the list, and that's The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. And one thing, I think I'd mark this as 5 stars? No, marked it as 4. I think I marked it as a 4-star just because while I love Grady Hendrix' style of writing, I think you either love it or you don't too much care for it and everything. I actually really love his style of writing, but I felt like he really kind of attacks these different psychological and social issues in his books. And in this one, I feel like he really talked about the early 90s and racial disparity and AIDS epidemic, even in the way that the sickness was being spread in this community, for deforestation, developments that were going up at that time, different classism issues, especially in the American South. And I think that he did an amazing job of that while having this vampire be the background of it. It was scary. Parts of it were gross, definitely made my stomach squirm, and I think he did a great job. However, I think I only gave it a 4 because there were moments where I feel like the black character, and most importantly, she kind of got snubbed and was used more as this vehicle to express racial social issues that were happening during the early 90s. And I would have maybe kind of preferred for her to feel more like a part of the group of main characters rather than a secondary character, because she was so attached to what was also happening with this vampire in their neighborhood. And I think that's the reason why I gave it 1 less star. It really just I couldn't give it a full 5 stars just because I felt strongly that she was not as much of a main character as I feel like she should have been. And that in the final hour, she just kind of came in and cleaned it all up for them, which I didn't too much care. I didn't like that because it just feels like that whole magical black character trope that sometimes happens in horror or fantasy or even in movies and stuff, where it's just this black character who is like all-knowing or holier than thou, like just knows more than these main characters who are typically white, and comes in and is like, y'all have no idea what you're doing, so I'm gonna clean this all up for you because I tried to let you do it and you couldn't do it right. I didn't too much care for that kind of thing that happened at the end, but I do feel like the rest of the book was really great. I also feel like I love the fact that it almost, like, their husbands were horrible. Oh my gosh, it was so, I had to stop reading sometimes because I was just like getting mad at my partner. And he was just like, why are you mad? And I'm like, because you're just a part of it. You're not it, thank God. But I'm just upset right now. The next book that is on my list is The Last House on Needless Street. So I'm going to be reading this November. This was a part of one of the reads that I wanted to go about reading. This one is a lot of people it's a little bit hard to lock down what the plot really is about, but a lot of people have said the ending really surprised them. And the last book I read that had that same type of review with the plot, and it's still one of my top 5 like favorite books because I gasped at the ending, like it was so good. So I'm hoping I get the same like reaction with The Last House on Needless Street and everything. But apparently it has to do with a man who's just lost his daughter, is very, like, spends his nights and his days alone in a very shabby house. And there's even a point of view of the cat in this book. I'm wondering if there's ghosts or if he's seeing things, if he's this serial killer that's going around town. I don't know. But a lot of people have been saying it's great. So I'm going to finally get around to reading that. But that's the third book that I, like, recognize on the list of like what I want to read. The next book that's on this list that I have read is Grady Hendrix' How to Sell a Haunted House. And I believe I actually gave that one 4.5 stars. No, I gave it 5. I gave it 5 stars. I gave this one 5 stars, and I remember why. I was so freaked. Like, the premise of this book has to do with grief. The main character of this book has just lost her parents, and she is dealing with how to split up their estate with her brother, who has no responsibility whatsoever. She essentially ends up inheriting this puppet her mother had called Pumpkin. It's possessed. The puppet's possessed. And what kind of comes from there? This book had me, like, there were parts where I could just see it. And that's why I love Grady Hendrix writing. I feel like it reads so much like a movie. Like, I can see what you're writing. And I appreciate that. Don't make it so atmospheric that I really have to build it out sometimes. I'm here for a good time. Not necessarily a huge academic one. Sometimes. I think I gave it 5 stars because I think that it really dealt with the conversations of generational secrets and trauma, of course, as well as just moving through grief and when you don't have much closure from a family member or something along those lines, and they pass on, how do you get your closure when it's one-sided? You can't get that conversation, as well as just the horror fact of, like, now I'm afraid of puppets. You would think, like, no, I'm not that afraid of puppets. Like, I guess Chucky or something, but, like, other than that, it's like, how can I be afraid of a puppet? No, if I saw Elmo in a dark alley trying to tickle me Elmo, I would probably be freaked out. Like, really scared. And I was listening to the audiobook, and it was so good. The audiobook was really good. And I just think that they definitely got the horror aspect of this and coming. It was just like something very different in left field, like using this possessed puppet, about like these conversations of grief and like closure and also generational like, again, I love the ending and the conversation of generational secrets and how secrets within a family that are passed on, like their actual history, are detrimental to family members because they are wondering why they're screwed up or why these issues are coming up, and they have no real insight and will never get insight if these secrets die with the people who actually know the truths, you know? And I just thought that was such a complex conversation that was using this like horror as a metaphor, but it's also a very like honest conversation that a lot of families need to have, where it's like, you know, this is an ugly part of our family history and we don't like to talk about it, but it's also important to talk about because, you know, people that are further down that generational line are wondering why these issues are coming up for them, and they'll never really get any answers on it because either nobody wants to talk about that real truth, the people who know it, or it ends up dying with them. That's why I gave it 5 stars. I thought that that was just done really, really well. The next book that is also a part of my reading challenge this month is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. So I talked a little bit about this in my November TBR. I've already started reading this one. I'm almost done with it, which I'm glad to say considering today is like the 5th. So I'm on track. But this one has to do with a queer couple. One of them is a marine biologist of some sort and goes on an expedition and doesn't come back up for months. She's lost at sea. They even declare her dead. And one day she resurfaces, and what happens after the fact, because she comes back different and her partner's trying to deal with, okay, who is this person that I'm with anymore? So far from me reading it, it really feels like these conversations of like depression, having a partner with depression or PTSD of some sort and not knowing how to reach that person anymore, and seeing that they've just changed so much. There's not much that they can even do about the change itself. So far, I feel like those are the metaphors that I've gotten from it, and I think that those metaphors are really well done. These conversations of depression and how that depression leaks into the relationship and even into the partner who like is trying to deal with the depression and everything. So far it's been great. I think that calling it a horror or even a thriller is kind of not correct. It's definitely suspense, atmospheric and everything, even like sci-fi kind of. But I don't think it should be maybe classified as a horror thriller just because it's just not high, like it's not moving and everything. It's definitely a slow read, but it's a slower story. Like I think that's why it really it really feels like it's hitting these points of like depression and that conversation. So I don't think it maybe should have been on this list. But so I'm enjoying myself. I just don't maybe think it should have been on the list. I've not finished it, so we'll see how the ending goes, and I'll vlog a little bit about how that goes. The next book is also another book that is on my November TBR, and I will be reading on this list for the first time, and that is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This has been all over the place. I could throw a book at and hit somebody who's read this book and has loved it. I want to see what the hype is about. It's literally less than 150 pages, and with the new Fall of the House of Usher Netflix show out and the book being based off of that, I'm excited to read this and then watch the show and see how these, like, they're both based on the Edgar Allan Poe story. So I'm excited to see how it all goes. It's about fungal horror and the main character going back to their childhood home and finding their childhood friend dealing with this sickness, this unknown sickness, and her brother seems to be weirded out, and I don't know what the rabbit is for, but it's something. It has to do with fungal horror though. So I don't know how much we're gonna get in 150 pages, but so many people have loved this book. So I'm excited. If it's packing that big of a punch in a short story, we love that. I'm finally gonna get to read it and see how it stacks up. It was definitely one of the books that I was like, this has to be on my list of ones that I'm going to read, just because I'm tired of hearing people reference it and I have no idea what they're talking about. So, and I don't know, maybe this will be my T. Kingfisher introduction, because so many people that I take their reviews and really like their recommendations, they absolutely love her work. So we will see. Maybe I will become a T. Kingfisher stan out of nowhere. The next book on the list that I've read is Ring Shout. It's a short novella again, but another one that I recommend to anybody I really recommend this book to anybody. It was such a great read. The audiobook was only I think 2 hours, and I picked it up in Seattle last year, and I read it I think last December or something, but it was so good. Again, it's a novella, so it's less than 150 pages, and it deals with the Klan as not necessarily the Klan, but they are aliens from another dimension, and they are here sucking on the hatred of the Klan to bring the second reckoning. And this is all taking place during the turn of the century, and the Birth of a Nation is out, and they're using the Birth of a Nation to incite hatred and find these people to bring basically the reckoning, where they come through it and everything. We know all this because there are 3 black women who are fighting these Kluxes. They call the aliens Kluxes. And they're fighting them like, you know, they're like monster hunters and everything. It's the best combination. I feel like if you really loved the actual, not the book, but the actual movie series of Lovecraft Country, you will love Ring Shout because it's in that same vein of using actual US history and combining it with this sci-fi horror thriller element and everything, and just like the conversation that US history, like some of the things that are happening in this actually happened, and that it seems almost like ridiculous that this is actually a part of our history. So let's add this sci-fi element to it, because honestly, all you need to do is change one singular thing and it sounds and reads like a sci-fi novel. I absolutely love this book. It was such a great read. I think I gave it 5 stars. I absolutely gave it 5 stars, but it was so good and I recommend it to anyone. The cover is crazy amazing. The illustrator went off on this cover, in my opinion. Even I hadn't really heard too many people talk about it, but I'd seen this cover multiple times and I needed to grab it off the shelf because it was just so good of a cover. But Ring Shout, so good, definitely deserves to be on this list. The next book that's on this list that I want to read but will not be reading this November is The Pallbearers Club by Paul Tremblay. Again, I've heard so many people say that they love this book, and I really like the idea that there are margins in the book where like these 2 people have been writing the book, and I've heard that it's a good one. I don't know if like look at the cover or I've heard like the synopsis, and I can't get a good read on if it really is a horror or a thriller. It feels more like a YA novel, but I also know Paul Tremblay writes a ton of horror. So, you know, I don't know. I'm not sure. Heard it's really great. I hope to read it sometime soon. It almost made the list of things I was going to read, but I felt, again, because I was so worried that it felt not extreme enough or something, that I would end up getting bored. And again, the book is not like a short read. So I was like, I'll read it next year, because it doesn't look like it's gonna get read this year. So it'll just it'll stay on my TBR, my digital TBR. The next book that I've read that's on the list is Mother Thing. I gave this 2 on a personal rating, 4 on a recommendation rating. And let me explain that a little bit. I gave it a 2 because the ending made me extremely uncomfortable. Just a trigger warning, this book has to do with necromancy. It's icky. I'm sorry if there's not. I read plenty of strange horror, a lot of like novels that cross the line. But there is one part in this book where necromancy happens, and I think that I found my line. And it's at necromancy, and the combination of necromancy and cannibalism within like maybe a 5-page distance was far too much for me to like enjoy the book. It was a weird, wild ride. Essentially has to do with a wife whose partner's mother just died. So her mother-in-law, and she died suicide, and she's essentially haunting the house that they're living in, and the downward spiral that happens from that. She hated her mother-in-law, by the way. And there's also a bit of Oedipus, I feel like, between the mother and the son. I think it was an interesting like read where you were just kind of like, where is it going? Because you feel her going into this insanity, and you're even questioning whether or not the house is haunted or if it's just grief. And then all of a sudden you get to about 10 pages, not even 50. We're getting 10 pages from the end and shit hits the fan. It was far too much all at once, and it left me going, what the fuck did I read? That's how I felt. As soon as I finished it, I was just like, it didn't feel like there was necessarily a solution. No, there was resolve. There was definitely resolve. I just feel like as a reader, you weren't resolved because it felt like out of nowhere. And there was no stopping. There was no safe word. There was nothing. And I didn't too much care for that. I feel like I've read books that are like that. Like the next book I'm going to talk about, I feel like near the end, really kind of, it just felt like you were rolling and you caught momentum and there was no stopping. But I feel like the cannibalism and necromancy within only 5 pages of each other, just that was a nail in the coffin for me, on me personally enjoying it. Now, speaking artistically, I feel like that was the point of this like shock horror of you reading that stuff. So I feel like my reactions was exactly what the author wanted, was this shock and this grossness and all of that. Not like, okay, I enjoyed reading that or something, you know? I feel like this has happened also with Tender as the Flesh with some people as of late, where they're just like, I have mixed feelings because I feel like it did exactly what it was supposed to do, which is just make me squirm so much that I almost didn't enjoy reading it. But that was also like, that's amazing writing. It wasn't just like, okay, you just threw that in there and like that wasn't necessary or whatever. It did feel like for the storyline, like these things happen, you know, it's why the word necromancy even exists, you know? But yeah, so as a personal read, it was definitely 1.5, 2 stars because of just how disturbed I was by the end. As like, you know, this is a writing style and you as a person are looking for something like that, would I recommend it to somebody who was saying like, I want to be disturbed? I would go read this book. It's worth your time. I don't feel like my time was wasted. I just feel disturbed. So, Mother Thing, I feel like deserved to be on this list for certain. Also, great cover. Again, I'm a sucker for a great cover. If the book looks like some like low budget paperback, I may not pick it up, or I'm just not gonna be gravitated to it like Riley Sager's sometimes look like. But great cover. Again, the illustrator went off on this one. The next book that I read was This Thing Between Us, another novella that was so good. It was a sci-fi horror, like fantastic. It has to do with a Latino couple in Chicago. They moved to what's becoming a more gentrified, like Southside Chicago, portion of Southside Chicago. And it turns out that their condo is like maybe haunted, or there's a rip in the tear of like a dimension. But all of this is happening through their version of an Alexa or a Google Home. And these weird packages start coming up to the house, like Lie, or books on how to commit a murder without getting caught. Or, you know, these things are weird that are happening. The main character's wife gets into an accident and passes. And essentially the rest of the story has to do with his downward spiral dealing with the grief, but through the lens of these fantastic things that are haunting him. And it's a question, and some portions of it is, you know, is his grief haunting him? Or is this a real haunting by like a spirit or something that is on him? I think I gave this one a 5. I would be surprised if I didn't give this one a 5. Did I give it a 5? Did I give it a 5? I gave it a 4? No. I don't see how I gave it a 4. Maybe it was a good reading year last year. I will say that. So I feel like when it's a good reading year, your standards are a little higher. I feel like it was a 5-star read. I can't believe I gave it a 4. What's wrong with me? It is a rough ending. Just a trigger warning again. This does deal with themes of suicide, and it doesn't say it kindly. So just keep that in mind. And also, because I know some people really are like, they want to know this, and there's a dog on the cover. The dog dies brutally. So again, just trigger warning on those things, because I know people they need to hear that. Still a great read in my opinion, and again, just a fantastic way of a metaphor for grief and the conversations of it. And it was atmospheric and weird, and the entire time you're kind of going, where are we going? But I want to know where it is going. And it was a novella, like it was a short read, and you got all of that, and that didn't feel like there was any parts of the story that were slow. This Thing Between Us, amazing, by Gus Moreno. Rouge is next on the list. I just finished Rouge last month. It was a buddy read. I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. I gave it 4. I gave it 4 because I knocked off a point. I knocked off a star because I was left with too many questions regarding the men in the novel. Rouge, though, is about a mother-daughter relationship and the conversations around, you know, not only just a mother-daughter relationship, but how does that relationship look like when you're a mixed child and your mother is a white woman and you don't know much about your culture, dealing with the ideas of European beauty standards, having a well-meaning mother who is trying her best but is, you know, a victim of those standards as well. which I think is a very complicated conversation, but one that is definitely one that needs to be had more often, as well as just this conversation of grief, losing a mother. Mona Wad's Bunny, it's cool. However, my problem with it was that it didn't get great until you were probably like 40-50% into the book. And by then you're kind of like, she spent so much on building this world and going into it into detail that you're like, I'm kind of lost on where we're going or where we are. It felt like the first 40% of the book should have been 10% of the book. Like you literally needed to cut your darlings. I keep on telling other people about the book. Like, I feel like literally and figuratively, she needed to cut her darlings out in that first 40% and then just get to the rest of it. And I feel like it would have been like a great maybe novella or something closer to it, just because she spent so much time building all of this stuff and it felt like it was getting lost in the plot. She must have heard those reviews from the few of us who said that and then went back to the drawing board and said, don't worry, I got you. Because Rouge, you read it and you feel like you're there. You feel like every second of it, you can see it in full Technicolor, but you're never losing really the plot. So much so that you start to really feel her descent into madness, the main character's descent into madness. And it's really scary. Beauty cult that she's a part of. And I keep telling, there's so many like things about this that reminded me of Vanilla Sky, the Tom Cruise movie. And that's the hill I will die on. That Mona Wad had watched Vanilla Sky by Tom Cruise and said, I can make this better. I can make this relevant. That's what I really love about it. The monologue from a jellyfish made me cry, or nearing it. It was the best monologue ever. I know that makes absolutely no sense, but I recommend you to go read it. I think the only reason why I gave it to start off was just there are men who are important characters in this book, and you never really get a clear answer on who they are outside of the main character and her story. It's like, if she's not in the room, they no longer exist type of thing. Which, you know, that's weird considering where books usually are. It's usually the other way around. But because of how important of characters they are, any other time I'd probably be like, I don't really care. But considering how important they are to the storyline, you kind of need to care about who and what they are. We are nearing the end. We have two more on the list. The next one is one that I literally just finished last month as well, and that was Dead 11 by Jimmy Giuliano. I ended up giving this a weird rating because, again, this was a book. This is Jimmy Giuliano's first published novel, and I feel like it reads that way. The beginning of this book, the first, I want to say 50, I don't even want to say like an actual like halfway point. I just feel like there are instances and situations in this novel that could have been cut out, and then what was left, the other situations that were still left, could have been fleshed out more to make it even creepier. It has to do with this island called Clifford Island, and everyone there is kind of stuck in this loop of 1994 or 93 or something along those lines and everything, in order to keep some big bad away of some sort. And a brother ends up coming to the island in search of his sister, who went to the island and went missing, and she had gone to the island looking for answers in regards to the death of her son. It has to do with conversations of grief and metaphors of that grief and nostalgia and all of this, which I think were good metaphors. I just feel like it got its creepiest and what I was looking for out of something that was essentially a cult book. After like the last like 40 pages or so, where I was like, oh, that's creepy. That's creepy and good. Where I feel like the rest of the book could have had that same energy, but because of like trying to like build this point home of having like these situations with these dead things and everything, we couldn't really get there. And I would have rathered him like cut some of those situations, the situations that were left, just going further into detail. The book read like a 3, but the ending read like a 4. So I think I ended up rounding up to a 4 because I gave it like a 3.5 to meet in the middle. I recommend you to go read it. Great covers again. Amazing cover again. But I recommend you to go read it to come to your own conclusion about it. I'm still excited to see what he comes out with next, because I feel like it's one of those Mona Wad situations where it's like, now that you've heard some of that, you go back to the drawing board and then like we perfect it in the next one. You know, it's all practice. So yeah, Monstrio. I have been wanting to read this book. It almost made a list, but I literally could not find it. I looked everywhere to try and read this, to find it, to add it to the list, and I was at this whole situation of like, if I can't find it physically in this bookstore when I had decided to make this challenge, then I'm like, it's not making it to the list. Unfortunately, it didn't make it to the list. I will read it at some point, but it is a story of a Mexican family and a mother who loses her young son, and she basically does something to try and bring him back. She brings him back, something that slightly looks like him, but he is actually a monster. And kind of what it is for him to grow up being this monster, what it is with her dealing with her grief and everything, and how they're trying to take care of him. And he's also kind of killing people. That's the consistent sense of the plot. Kind of sounds like it's like a Frankenstein, Mexican Frankenstein type of story. But I'm interested to see like how like that storyline kind of develops and its conversations around motherly grief. I've been reading a lot of grief books as of late, not on purpose. It's like when I've been reading a lot of mother horror. You just start to see trends. I'll read it at some point. It is on the TBR, but we will see. So that is the list, but the books that I will be reading for this challenge are Our Wives Under the Sea, The Last House on Needless Street, What Moves the Dead, and Dead Silence. Dead Silence was the other book that I was going to be reading, and that one is the sci-fi horror that has to do with the group that go on an expedition and find a luxury space liner that had went lost years ago, and when they go to kind of take the scraps from it, they find out that it's actually haunted, and maybe the people who were on that ship aren't necessarily gone, but something else happened. So those are the 4 books that I'll be reading in this upcoming month. Check out my review of it, my full review of how it turns out in my November wrap-up. That'll be at the end of this month, along with how the rest of these books go. But I wanted to just kind of put this challenge out here along with the list and everything, just in case you wanted to make your own challenge of reading some of what Goodreads says was the best published horror and thriller in the past 3 years, and yeah, even ask you how you feel like everything stacked up in your opinion if you've read some of these books that are on the list, and even how you feel about some of the reviews I've given of books that I have read that are on the list. So yeah, this has been great. I am so happy that I'm back into my thriller horror genre reading era again. I'm having a good time so far, and I hope to keep that up, and expect more videos about that throughout December. Although spooky season is over and I am putting up the Christmas decorations as we speak, in my heart, spooky season is still happening with the books that I'm reading. So stay looking for that content and subscribe down below if that interests you. And yeah, I hope that these books go well. You will know by watching my November wrap-up at the end of this month to see how it goes. But that'll be all today. See you guys. Bye.